Atoussa Kassisarde, who will be talking on Friday at noon at the center in person on how we should think about AI risk. That's the topic of her talk. And on Tuesday next week, Mark Risjord, who is a fellow at the center this semester from Emory, will be talking about due diligence and epistemic caution, an impartial account of inductive risk. Next week on Friday, we have the first lecture in 2006 for the annual lecture series, which will be given by my friend Felipe de Briga on remembering from Duke. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague from Brown and friend, Chris Hill, who is a professor of philosophy in the philosophy department at Brown, but also in the cognitive science department at Brown, which is a wonderful unit of Brown. Chris has written Chris works mostly at the intersection of philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science. He has done some very important work on issues related to perception and consciousness. I will note that he has written several books on this topic. The most recent books are Perceptual Experience with OUP in 22 and Meaning, Mind, and Knowledge, also with OUP in 2014. He is working on a new book on concepts, and we hope to have the pleasure to read this book sooner than later. But we shall see. I know how long it can take to write a book. Chris has some deep connections with Pittsburgh. In fact, he started his career, is that right, at the University of Pittsburgh after finishing his PhD at Harvard. He was a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's been a visitor of the center. He's been a fellow at the center for 2 semesters, one in 1995, 1996, and when I met Chris in 2006, 2007. So now a while ago, when he was a fellow at the center, and I was just starting my career here at the center. And Chris has engaged a lot with the philosophers of mind here at the University of Pittsburgh over the years, and we've seen him on a regular basis here, including a few weeks ago in December. So Chris, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back at the center, and if online this time, hopefully sooner than later in person. And the floor or the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Edouard. I can't see the audience. Is that
that is normal. It's we use the webinar function of Zoom, so that's normal.
Well, okay. So I want to thank Edouard and Chantal for setting this up, and Edouard for that splendid introduction. I apologize that I have to read this, and it looks like I can't bring it up on the screen given the arrangement, the video arrangement that's been. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I can. No, it appears that I can't bring it up on the screen, so I'm going to have to read it. And I hope that Edouard has been able to circulate copies to all of the audience that I sent him over the weekend. So hopefully you have copies and can read along with me, because I can't put it appears that I can't put the text on the screen.
Chris, let me interrupt for a second. If some of you want a copy of because there are people who I didn't know would join us online. If some of you want a copy of the paper, I will put my email in the webinar chat. Send me an email, and I will immediately forward you the paper so that you have it and can follow along. Is that okay, Chris?
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Since I can't see you, I can't tell whether I'm going too fast or too slow. Speaking loudly enough, maybe Edouard can let me know how things are going. So, okay, good so far, I guess. So this is entitled A Pragmatic Conception of the A Priori, and it goes like this. When claims about types of a priori belief are put forward, definitions and laws of logic are often at the top of the list, singled out as especially clear cases. Sorry, trying to get my timer here. I will consider such claims in the present talk, that is, claims about definitions and laws of logic being a priori. More specifically, I will be considering whether definitional and logical beliefs are justified a priori, or a belief counts as justified a priori, just in case, first, the belief has a justification that is independent of empirical evidence, and second, this justification cannot be canceled or undermined by empirical discoveries. There are several different types of doxastic justification. Perhaps the one that is most prominent in the literature is warrant or epistemic justification. That is the kind of justification that figures in knowledge. Another prominent type is epistemic entitlement or permissibility, a weaker form that characterizes a belief when the believer is not epistemically at fault for holding it. A third type of justification, sometimes called epistemic rationality, is the kind of rationality which one displays when one believes propositions that are strongly supported by one's evidence and refrains from believing propositions that are improbable given one's evidence. I'm quoting from Tom Kelly there. I think that's kind of a representative statement of this type of justification. Important though they are, I will not be principally concerned with any of these types of epistemic justification here. Instead, I will be focusing on pragmatic justification. That is, roughly speaking, the form of justification that a belief possesses if it serves non-empirical practical interests to hold it. Arguably, each of the three types of epistemic justification requires some sort of correspondence relation between beliefs and the world. And I find it hard to see how the world could contribute to justification independently of experiential contact with it. But any experiential contact with the world would count as empirical evidence, and would therefore preclude a priori as defined above. As we will see, the situation with pragmatic justification is different. The main goal of the present talk is to show that definitional and logical beliefs have pragmatic a priori justifications. Pragmatic justifications are sometimes derided by epistemologists on the grounds that they authorize beliefs that are epistemically problematic. For example, it might boost the morale of the defendant in a murder case to believe that the jury is sympathetic. But unless he has evidence for this belief, it can seem to be epistemically defective. I hope to avoid this skepticism by drastically restricting the scope of the concept of a pragmatic a priori justification. More specifically, I will limit its scope to propositions that first have no empirical content, and second, can be added to systems of belief conservatively. That is, roughly speaking, without generating new propositions that consist of vocabulary items from the original system. Among other things, condition 2 precludes claiming a priori pragmatic justifications for propositions affirming the existence of non-empirical entities, such as a world transcendent deity, with properties specifiable in terms of that prior vocabulary. For example, the property of transcending the world. The talk will have three sections. One that discusses explicit definitions, another that is concerned with implicit definitions, and a third that focuses on rules of inference for classical logic. So the pragmatic a priori is exemplified by explicit definitions. Roughly speaking, explicit definitions equate simpler expressions with longer and more cumbersome ones. An example is the definition of the word fortnight in terms of, quote, period of 14 days. I will argue that we are pragmatically justified in accepting such definitions and also in holding them immune to empirical revision. As I see it, the primary cognitive role of fortnight is to serve as an abbreviation for a period of 14 days. That is the only cognitive role of the term. Thus, for example, it is also used to encode information about certain intervals of time, specifically periods of 14 days. But the abbreviative role of fortnight appears to subsume its informational role as a special case. When we use fortnight to encode information, we do so because we have an interest in increasing the efficiency with which information about periods of 14 days is encoded. It would be possible to encode the same information using the longer expression, period of 14 days, but that would require more time and make larger demands on memory. Moreover, what holds in this case appears to hold quite generally. The abbreviative role of fortnight appears to subsume all of its other roles. Assuming that this is correct, you can see that the reasons for adopting a definition are practical. Increasing economy and efficiency are practical concerns. It follows that the form of justification that attaches to definitional beliefs is pragmatic justification. But how should the abbreviative role of the term be explained? The answer, I suggest, is that we accept the following statement as a definition, or something like it. Something is a fortnight just in case it is a period of 14 days. In saying that we accept D as a definition, I intend to be making two claims. First, I mean that we accept D in our actual situation, and will continue to accept it in any alternative situation, provided only that there was motivation within the situation to talk of periods of 14 days in the first place. And second, I mean that we are disposed to be guided by D in using fortnight, for this involves using the term interchangeably with period of 14 days in all contexts. It is, as I see it, where fortnight is any context of the term, we are so disposed that we would not accept F fortnight in any situation in which we rejected F period of 14 days, and we would not accept F period of 14 days in any situation in which we rejected F fortnight. Can this view really be true? Is it realistic to suppose that we possess the dispositions in question? On the whole, it seems pretty clear that dispositions of the kind I have invoked are possible. We could acquire dispositions of the given sort. This much seems to have been acknowledged even by Quine, who is perhaps more skeptical about claims attributing a privileged status to abbreviative definitions than any other figure in history. As I read him, Quine's concern was not about the idea that definitions might be immune to disconfirmation, but about the more adventurous idea that they can retain this status across time. Thus, in a famous passage, he considers the possibility that definitions are introduced by stipulative conventions, and that this basis in convention gives them a free pass in the tribunal of evidence. He does not reject the possibility altogether, but rather says this about it. Conventionality is a passing trait, significant at the moving front of science, but useless in classifying the statements behind the lines. It is a trait of events and not of statements. The idea seems to be that a disposition to treat a statement as a definition is highly transitory. One may be so disposed when a definition is first adopted. According to Quine, however, as one continues to use a defined term, it will eventually prove convenient to deploy the term in empirical claims without checking to see whether they have the same evidential properties as the corresponding claims containing the definitions. With reference to the case at hand, the point is that fortnight will over time acquire proprietary associations that will pull it away from its original mooring, requiring it to follow paths in empirical reasoning that diverge from the paths followed by a period of 14 days. Once this divergence has occurred, it can easily happen that a statement containing one of these expressions encounters evidence that confirms it, while counting against the corresponding statement involving the latter expression. Reflection shows that there is a serious problem with this Quinean line of thought. It assumes without argument that the forces holding fortnight and period of 14 days together will necessarily be weaker than the forces pulling them apart. More specifically, it assumes that the value of having an abbreviation for a complex expression is outweighed by the convenience of being able to use fortnight ad libitum in framing empirical claims. We should not accept this thesis until we are given a substantial supporting argument. But anyway, the thesis seems quite implausible. Hey, Dwar, is there any way you can give me a sign that will indicate whether I'm going too fast or too slow? Okay, well, I'll proceed at pretty much the same pace.
Sorry, Chris, I had to come back from the main room.
Oh, sorry.
It's good. It's perfect.
Oh, okay, great, fantastic. Thanks so much. Anyway, the thesis seems quite implausible. If it was originally desirable to introduce fortnight as an abbreviation for a period of 14 days, why wouldn't it be just as desirable at a later time to continue to use it for that purpose? On the face of it, there would be no reason for a change in desirability. Further, the convenience of using fortnight in empirical endeavors without regard to its association with a period of 14 days seems to be a fiction. The natural view is that it is useful to deploy fortnight in empirical endeavors just because it abbreviates a period of 14 days, thereby enabling us to put forward simpler doctrines than would otherwise be necessary. It is the abbreviatory role of fortnight that makes it convenient to use the term in formulating empirical claims in the first place. It appears then that the picture of abbreviated definitions that I sketched a few paragraphs back can be defended against the Quinian challenge. We can comfortably hold that the use of fortnight is fixed in possible evidential situations, as well as in actual ones, by D and the attendant dispositions to use fortnight in period of 14 days interchangeably. Now it follows as a special case of this general principle that the relations to evidence of statements containing fortnight are the same as the relations to evidence of the corresponding statements containing period of 14 days. But if this is right, then it is plausible that D is unrevisable. For D to be challenged by evidence, there would have to be either a body of evidence that supports a particular context of fortnight, while counting against the corresponding context of period of 14 days, or a body of evidence with the opposite import. But it is plausible that we have an evidential policy concerning context of fortnight that prevents this from happening. This conclusion is in need of clarification, but for that I need some terminology. I will say that a statement is weakly unrevisable if we will not permit S to be challenged by empirical evidence in any evidential situation. In view of the argument in the last 3 paragraphs, we can conclude that instances of D are weakly unrevisable. I will also say that S is strongly unrevisable if S is weakly unrevisable, and we would have reason to accept it in any evidential situation. Thus, while weak unrevisability depends on whether we would ever be led by evidence to deny a statement, strong unrevisability is concerned in part with whether we would always have motivation to accept a statement. I have in effect argued that D is weakly unrevisable. Is it also strongly unrevisable? That is, are there situations in which we would abandon D because we would have no motivation to deploy the term fortnight? Reflection shows that the answer to this question is yes. Our motivation would be eroded if for some reason we lost our interest in measuring time in terms of days. Consider the following passage about people newly arrived on an island in the far north of Norway. We unpack. How many days it takes is difficult to say. For here there are no days because there are no nights. One day melts into the next, and you cannot say this is the end of today, and now it is tomorrow, and that was yesterday. It is always light, the sea is always murmuring, and the mist stands immovable as water around as a wall around the hut. We eat when we are hungry, we sleep when we are tired. This passage calls attention to one way in which the concept of a day might lose its currency. People might acquire evidence that there would be no more sunrises and no more sunsets. This evidence would undercut the rationale for marking off time in 24-hour units. To be sure, the descendants of the people who made this discovery would hang on to the concept of a day long after it had ceased to be used as a measure of time. Among other reasons, they would need it to characterize the beliefs of their forebears, who found it natural to rely on the concept. But they might eventually lose their interest in recording such ancient beliefs and gradually forget that people had ever been wedded to the concept. And of course, when the concept of a day disappeared, the concept of a fortnight would disappear with it. In this way, a change in our empirical circumstances might cause people to lose the dispositions that now sustain our use of fortnight. Hence, such a change might undercut the motivation for accepting D, even though it produced no evidence that directly challenged the statement. Quine did not distinguish between weak unrevisability and strong unrevisability. I'm inclined to think that this may have lent a specious plausibility to his claim that all statements, including even definitions, are empirically revisable. This doctrine is quite interesting if it is understood as denying that definitions are weakly unrevisable, but on that reading, it is not especially plausible. Indeed, I have urged that it is false. On the other hand, the doctrine is true if it is understood as denying only that definitions are strongly unrevisable. But on that reading, it is not especially interesting, since it is a claim that after a little reflection, we are quite prepared to accept. As I see it, if the doctrine seems both true and challenging, this is very likely because one is confusing weak unrevisability with strong unrevisability. Since everything that has been said about fortnight seems to hold for other terms that are used to abbreviate expressions with empirical content, we can conclude that the definitions governing all such terms are weakly unrevisable, but not strongly unrevisable. I have so far maintained that we are under a practical obligation to adopt a policy for assessing the bearing of bodies of evidence on D and its ilk that protects them from empirical challenge. I will now consider the question of whether it is epistemically permissible to adopt such policies. Are there more general epistemic norms that prohibit them? More particularly, are they compatible with the epistemic norms that require us to respect evidence, calling on us to adapt our beliefs to evidence, rather than allowing our beliefs to dictate what evidence will be recognized, or to dictate what the import of the recognized evidence will be? I'll maintain that the answer to this question is yes. I will argue first that the local policy that protects abbreviated definitions from empirical challenge has no tendency to determine or influence the contents of bodies of evidence. It does not in any way change the evidence that is currently available to us. What counts as our evidence, independently of acceptance of abbreviated definitions, also counts as our evidence given acceptance of such definitions. I will then argue that the policy is not in conflict with the Duhamian norms that aim to democratize belief revision by implying that we should cast our net widely in figuring out how to revise our system of beliefs when predicted evidence fails to materialize. It might seem that we should cast our Duhamian net widely enough to include definitions, but I will defend the opposite view. In order to consider the question of epistemic permissibility properly, we need the notion of a conservative extension. So I hope people have copies of this that they can look at here. It's a little technical. Let T be a theory, V the vocabulary in which statements of T are couched, V star a larger vocabulary that is obtained by adding new terms to V, and T star a theory obtained by adding statements containing the new members of V star to T. T star is a conservative extension of T, just in case every theorem of T star that is constructed entirely of terms from V is already a theorem of T. So the idea is that we, if you, in addition to a theory, is conservative, if it doesn't enable you to prove any sentences in the old vocabulary that you couldn't have proved before the addition was made. Now, when we add D to a system of beliefs, the definition of a fortnight, when we add D to a system of beliefs, the resulting new system is a conservative extension of the former system. That is, where S is a system of beliefs, and S star is the larger system obtained by adding D to S, any consequence of S that does not contain fortnight, any consequences of S that do not contain fortnight, will already be consequences of S. Sorry, any consequences of S star that do not contain fortnight will already be consequences of S. This follows from the fact that all definitions with a form of D are conservative. This is pointed out, for example, in Anil's paper on definitions in SEP. I cite an earlier form of it, but it's the same as true of the current edition of SEP, his article with someone else in the current edition. In view of this result, we can be sure that it is possible to add instances of D to any beliefs that lack fortnight without generating new evidential commitments. But what about the Duhamian norms that purport to democratize revision, counseling us to maintain a broad focus in identifying candidates for revision of beliefs when predictions fail? It may be helpful to discuss this question in relation to an example. Consider 1 and 2. When the circus comes to town, it always stays for a fortnight. The circus has only been here for a week. Given D, we can deduce the following proposition. The circus will be here for another week. Now we can easily imagine a situation in which there is a lot of evidence for 1 and 2, but in which 3 turns out to be false. Since D contributes to generating 3, an extreme Duhemian might claim that a situation of this sort should put at least some pressure on us to reject D. But if this is right, there would be tension between the Duhemian injunction to view belief updating as a fully democratic process and the local policy of protecting D from challenge to evidence. The issue here boils down to the question of whether the Duhemian injunction should take precedence over the local policy. Aquinian will no doubt argue that if we adhere to the local policy, we could lose an opportunity to maximize Quinian values like simplicity, predictive power, and continuity. But this would only be true if protecting D was somehow incompatible with pursuing Quinian values, and it clearly is not. On the contrary, maintaining the abbreviative capacities of terms seems to promote the Quinian goal of efficient prediction. This reprises an earlier point. It turns out then that it is possible to make a strong commitment to D without violating either the general epistemic norm that requires us to refrain from manipulating evidence, or the norm that requires us to give evidence its due. Accordingly, we can claim to have established both of the following claims. First, there are very strong practical reasons for adopting epistemic policies that protect instances of definitions from empirical revision. And second, it is epistemically permissible to adopt these policies. Pulling the various parts of the foregoing discussion together, we can also claim to have established that we are pragmatically justified a priori, both in adopting definitions and in holding them immune to empirical revision, provided that by immune to revision, we mean weakly immune to revision. See how time I'm doing swimming. Okay, the pragmatic a priori is implied by, by implicit definitions. While there is a diversity of opinion about the exact nature and function of implicit definitions, there is agreement that an implicit definition of a term, alpha, is a set of principles containing alpha that do not provide an explicit definition of alpha, but rather confer meaning on it in a different way. Specifically, by stipulating that any potential referent of alpha must stand to die. While there's a diversity of opinion about the exact nature and function of implicit definitions, there is agreement that an implicit definition of a term alpha is a set of principles P containing alpha that do not provide an explicit definition of alpha, but rather confer meaning on it in a different way, specifically by stipulating that any potential referent of alpha must stand in P-specified relations to independently determine reference of the other terms in P. A familiar example is the set of first-order Peano postulates for number theory, which can be said to implicitly constrain the interpretation of natural number by specifying relations in which any such interpretation must stand to the standard interpretations of zero and successor. I will maintain that implicit definitions that have a certain form satisfy the criteria for being pragmatically a priori justified that were adopted in the last section. More specifically, I will argue that implicit definitions that have this form can count as conservative additions to pre-existing theories, and that the motivation for adopting them can be simply that of enriching available vocabulary. The ultimate goal of the enrichment will usually be that of providing a foundation for new empirical work, but the enrichment itself won't add to the empirical content of a pre-existing theory in any way. For expository reasons that will become clear as we proceed, it will be helpful to have a schematic example of an implicit definition before us. Let us agree to view P alpha as the conjunction of a set of principles containing the novel term alpha that we are thinking about adding to a pre-existing theory T. Here, P alpha and T can either be mathematical or empirical in content. Suppose that alpha is the only term in P alpha that is novel. What I'm about to say can easily be generalized to cases in which theories contain two or more novel terms. Let the other terms in P alpha all derive from T, and let them already have meanings in virtue of their roles in that prior theory. Now, since alpha is introduced by P alpha, it is entirely dependent on P alpha for any meaning that it may possess. It follows that any entity that serves as an interpretation of alpha will have to stand in the P alpha specified relations to the entities that serve as the reference of the other terms in P alpha. That is, the terms in P alpha that it inherits from T. But this means that P alpha can serve as an implicit definition of alpha. This follows from the characterization of implicit definitions 2 paragraphs back. With these assumptions in the background, it is possible to introduce the notion of a Carnap statement. The Carnap statement of our schematic set of principles P alpha is the following conditional. If there is an X such that P of X, then P of alpha. This statement has some very interesting properties. First, it constrains interpretations of alpha to the same degree as, and in exactly the same ways as, P alpha itself. As we just observed, P alpha constrains the interpretations of alpha by requiring each interpretation to assign an entity to alpha that stands in the P alpha specified relations to the entities that serve as interpretations of the terms in P alpha that belong to T. In short, P alpha constrains the interpretations of alpha by requiring that they satisfy the conditions expressed by Px. Note that it says nothing about the possibility that no such interpretations exist. It simply presupposes that their interpretations are satisfied. Now, the Carnap statement of P alpha imposes the same restriction on interpretations of alpha. The only difference is that it explicitly acknowledges the possibility that there is no interpretation of alpha that satisfies the conditions expressed by Px, and the attendant possibility that P alpha might not be able to confer meaning on alpha. It acknowledges these possibilities by saying, in effect, that if there are any interpretations that satisfy the conditions expressed by Px, they must assign an entity to alpha that stands in the P alpha specified relations to the entities that serve as interpretations of the terms in P alpha that belong to T. In short, then, the two formulations differ just in that the Carnap statement includes an assumption that P alpha only presupposes. But as we saw, P alpha counts as an implicit definition of alpha. It follows that the Carnap statement is also an implicit definition of alpha, one that assigns the same meaning to it as P alpha does. This exposition of the present point accords with the classic exposition in Lewis. The second interesting property of the Carnap statement P alpha is that it is conservative with respect to the prior theory T in its proprietary vocabulary. If the Carnap statement is added to T, the resulting larger theory will have no non-logical consequences containing only the vocabulary of T that were not already consequences of T. This holds because, as the mere consequent of a conditional, P alpha is not available to interact logically with the statements of T. Before it can interact with them, it would be necessary to add the claim that there is at least one X, such that Px to the new theory T union with the Carnap statement of P alpha. Until that is done, P alpha is frozen in the interior of the Carnap statement. It is assumed that the claim isn't already a component of T. The third interesting property of the Carnap statement of P alpha is this. If it is used to define alpha, then it is possible to use alpha with a full share of meaning without being committed either to P alpha or any of its non-logical consequences. For suppose that the Carnap statement is used to define alpha, then it is possible to count as knowing the meaning of alpha simply in virtue of accepting the Carnap statement. And it is, of course, possible to accept the Carnap statement without accepting P alpha. This is interesting because, as Boghossian has emphasized, it is highly desirable to be able to use a term with a full share of meaning without being committed to any supporting substantive assumptions, including the assumption that there exists an entity that serves as the referent of the term. This is because, quote, you want the possessor of a concept to be able to coherently ask whether there is anything that falls under it, and you want people to be able to disagree about whether there is. In other words, since there are contexts in which we want to be able to use a term without making any substantive assumptions, we should allow for the meanings of terms to be determined independently of such assumptions. This is exactly what a Carnap statement enables us to do, when it is used as an implicit definition. The fourth interesting property of the Carnap statement is that it affects a substantial simplification in reasoning. Suppose that we are initially unsure as to whether the following existential claim is true. R. There is an X such as PX. Suppose further that we eventually acquire evidence that leads us to accept the statement. We are now poised to use the statement in deriving predictions and giving explanations. But as we all know, using existentially quantified statements in reasoning is a pain. Each deployment of an existential statement requires a separate application of existential instantiation, a maneuver that adds significantly to the complexity of proofs. But if we were then to add our Carnap statement to R, namely, if there is an X such as PX, then P of alpha, modus ponens would entitle us to use P alpha in all contexts in which we would have used R, thereby significantly simplifying what would have otherwise been a number, perhaps a large number, of more complex derivations. In effect, the Carnap sentence simplifies reasoning by collapsing what would otherwise have been many applications of existential instantiation into a single one. It therefore serves a practical need, like the ones served by explicit definitions, the need for abbreviation. Combining the second, third, and fourth of these four features of Carnap statements, we can see that when Carnap statements are adopted as implicit definitions, they satisfy the two criteria for pragmatic a priori justification that we considered earlier. Applied to the case at hand, these criteria require, first, that the Carnap statement of P is conservative in the sense that it can be added to the prior theory T without thereby increasing the consequences of T that are constructed purely from the vocabulary of T. And second, that there are practical presuppositionless reasons for adopting the Carnap statement as an implicit definition of alpha. Sorry. With a view to bringing this somewhat abstract line of thought down to earth, let's consider the role of the term phlogiston in contemporary discourse. Historically, the role of the term was determined by a theory that claimed, among other things, that when metals are heated, phlogiston is released into the atmosphere, with the result that the heated substances lose mass. We know today that the theory is false, but the term phlogiston continues to serve various purposes. Among these is the desire to explain the motivation for modern chemistry by showing how it was inspired, in part, by the failures of phlogiston theory. An explanation of this sort might take the following form. If there was such a thing as phlogiston, then all metals would lose mass when they burn. But experiments have shown that some heated metals gain mass, so phlogiston doesn't exist. It's hard to account for the meaning and appropriateness of this argument unless it is assumed that phlogiston theory, PT phlogiston, is lurking somewhere in the background. But we no longer believe PT phlogiston. So the question arises, what other principle can ground the use of phlogiston in counterfactual contexts? It must somehow make the theory for PT phlogiston available without asserting that theory. Reflection shows that the Carnap statement, if there exists an X such as PTX, then PT phlogiston fills the bill. If we are supposed that we are committed to this statement, and that our commitment to it involves a subordinate commitment to using it as a background principle in counterfactual contexts, we can account for the fact that phlogiston can play various predetermined roles in counterfactual reasoning. If such reasoning begins with, there exists an X such that PTX as an explicit assumption, then the given background principle will make PT phlogiston available to guide our use of phlogiston in the ensuing counterfactual argument. In the previous section, we took note of a distinction between weak unrevisability and strong unrevisability. As a reader, as you may recall, a statement S counts as weakly unrevisable if S cannot be directly challenged by empirical evidence in any evidential situation. In contrast, S counts as strongly unrevisable if S is weakly unrevisable and we would have reason to accept it in any evidential situation. Accordingly, while weak unrevisability depends on whether we would ever be led by evidence to deny a statement, strong unrevisability is concerned in part with whether we would always have motivation to accept a statement. Carnap statements are weakly unrevisable. Since they have no empirical content, but serve merely to confer meaning on expressions, they cannot directly conflict with empirical discoveries of any kind. Also, as we have just seen, there can be reason to hold on to a Carnap statement even after we cease to believe the empirical theory in which it is embedded. But a Carnap statement doesn't normally count as strongly unrevisable. Consider the case of phlogiston. As we saw, it is desirable for us to be able to use the term with a full share of meaning, even now, long after you have rejected the theory in which it was originally embedded. But the value of our retaining it is contingent on our continuing to be interested in the beliefs of 18th century scientists and the origins of modern chemistry. We can easily imagine that 100 years from now, no one will care about those topics. Is there a case of strong unrevisability? I have maintained elsewhere that the answer is yes. Arguably, it is possible to give an explicit definition of the concept of truth in a language with substitutional quantification. But in a language without that resource, truth has to be implicitly defined by the set of all statements that have the following form. Consider an agent who speaks such a language, that is a first-order language. Whatever this agent's epistemic situation may be, the agent will need to possess a T-based concept of truth. This is because, as Quine and a number of other authors have emphasized, one of the functions of a concept of truth is to enable compact summaries of otherwise unmanageably large sets of statements. We can, for example, express an endorsement of quantum mechanics by saying that all of its countless predictions are true. It is essential for beings with limited cognitive powers to be able to compress large bodies of evidence in this way, no matter what their beliefs may be, and no matter what evidence for those beliefs they may have. To illustrate, even if we came to reject the testimony of our senses as illusory and retain only our beliefs in the laws of mathematics, we would still need to deploy true in formulating our main beliefs. Specifically, we would need to endorse both of the following statements. None of the claims that are grounded in sense experience are true. All of the laws of mathematics are true. But for speakers of first-order languages, the ability to formulate such claims depends on acceptance of the instances of T. Hence, it isn't possible for the peculiarities of any epistemic situation to undercut our motivation for accepting these instances, which means that acceptance of them is strongly unrevisable. Admittedly, more needs to be said to make a full case for this conclusion, but as I mentioned, I have an earlier paper about that. As Horwich and Bogosian have pointed out, it makes sense to suppose that the use of a number of terms in our common sense and scientific vocabularies is implicitly governed by Carnap statements. Moreover, as Gibbard has maintained, there is a case for thinking that a rational reconstruction of the notion of meaning would rely heavily on Carnap statements. So the idea of a pragmatic a priori justification could turn out to have a wide scope. I turn now to consider a way of arguing for the a priority of the rules of inference or classical logic, together with the a priority of the laws that can be generated by iterated applications of those rules. There will be a continuing assumption that our reasoning is in fact guided by classical logic, at least on occasions on which we are being ideally attentive, reflective, and principled. This assumption can be challenged. The prominent role that classical logic transparently plays in mathematics and other deductively rigorous disciplines provides substantial evidence that it is true. I will also assume more controversially, that it's in principle possible for there to be empirical discoveries that put rational pressure on us to revise classical logic, at least in reasoning about the domains in which the empirical discoveries pertain. My reason for this assumption is that a number of rational and well-informed thinkers have actually proposed revising classical logic to accommodate empirical discoveries in quantum mechanics, maintaining that classical logic should give way to the weaker system, quantum logic, in which the following distributive law fails to hold. If P and Q are R, then P and Q or P and R. This proposal was first made explicit in a paper by Hilary Putnam. I'm not sure that's true. Maybe Finkelstein preceded him, but let's pretend it's true for the moment. This proposal was first made explicit in a paper by Hilary Putnam, who had shown that in earlier work that he had a deep and comprehensive grasp of quantum mechanics. But it was soon examined and endorsed by others, and interest in this proposal has continued to the present day. So here's what Maudlin says. But many philosophers and physicists have become convinced that a change in logic, and most dramatically, the rejection of classical logic, will somehow help in understanding quantum theory, or is somehow suggested or forced on us by quantum theory. A number of these advocates have been well-informed and rigorous thinkers. This suggests that it can be rational to consider revising classical logic to accommodate empirical discoveries. Be sure, this suggests that it can be rational to consider revising classical logic. Be sure there are contemporary arguments that Putnam's original reasoning involved confusions. Two papers by Maudlin are notable for stating what seems to be the most damning of these objections. I will consider one which, if legitimate, would be especially damning, amounting to a charge of egregious irrationality. As I read him, in this argument, Maudlin in effect asks two questions. First, how could classical logic, which is devoid of empirical import, possibly be responsible for generating false empirical results? Maudlin evidently believes that this obviously isn't possible. And second, if classical logic isn't responsible for these results, how could a change in logic possibly help with the situation? If appropriate, these questions would indicate that Putnam ventured way off course. As far as I can see, the objection isn't fair. We need not assume that if classical logic is somehow at fault, it is because its empirically neutral rules of inference have generated a problem. Rather, the problem arises from the assumption that classical connectives are used in formulating the basic empirical assumptions of quantum theory. If the logical structure of the basic assumptions of quantum theory is classical, this, of course, commits us to using classical rules of inference in deducing consequences from the assumptions. But if the connectives weren't classical, then the empirically challenged predictions wouldn't be deducible from the basic assumptions. When the situation is described in this way, it is clear that trading classical connectives for different ones, governed by weaker rules of inference, should be allowed as an option. Maudlin states other objections, but I see no reason to think that they support a charge of irrationality. I mean, they indicate confusions, but these seem to be confused. I think can be understood as confusions due to dealing with being the first person to deal with very complicated issues in the way that Putnam did. At all events, as noted earlier, I will assume that it can be epistemically rational to consider departing from classical logic to accommodate empirical data. Having described a rationale for this assumption, I will now turn to arguing that there is always an a priori pragmatic justification for retaining classical logic, even in situations in which there are empirical grounds for revising it. This is not to say that there is always a pragmatic justification for retention that can outweigh or undermine empirical grounds for revision. The point is the much more modest one that in situations in which revision of logic is on the table, there will always be a tension between empirical pressure for revision and practical pressure for retention. It isn't clear how such tension should be resolved. Indeed, it may be that there is no lexical ordering of empirical and practical considerations, that strictly speaking, they're incomparable. But I will not be addressing this issue. I will just be concerned to outline a pragmatic justification for retention. The justification will have two parts. First, I will point out that the classical rules of inference are conservative, at least when they are considered en bloc. They can be added to any pre-existing theory without thereby increasing the consequences of the theory that contain the pre-existing vocabulary, except for those consequences that count as logically valid. In brief, this means that adding classical logic to an empirical theory does not increase the empirical content of the theory. And second, I will remind you that classical logic is quite powerful. Because of this quality, when a proposition is derivable using both classical logic and a weaker system, W, the proof of it using classical logic tends to be simpler and often much simpler than the proof using W. It follows that the proofs in classical logic tend to be easier to find and understand than proofs in W. Two practical virtues of considerable importance that always speak in favor of revision. So, as evidence of this, I submit a paper by Takayuti on quantum logic as a basis for set theory. I've tried to understand that paper 1,000 times, and it's just too complex. A few people can understand, of course, but having a quantum logical base for classical set theory just does not make life easier. That the rules of inference for the classical operators are conservative can be seen by reflecting on two facts, both of which were first established by Gensen. I use classical operators to stand both for the classical sentential connectives and the classical quantifiers. The first fact is that classical logic can be formulated as a sequent calculus, and the second is that a cut elimination theorem can be proved for the calculus. So I think I'm going to skip this argument. It's kind of technical and I'm short of time. So I'll just say the conservativeness of the classical rules and laws will be presupposed in the sequel. I'm on page 15 now, if you're following it, my printed version. Let's now consider the question of whether there can be pragmatic a priori justification for reasoning in accordance with the classical rules of inference. Given that the rules are conservative, we can see, I think, that the answer is yes. To fix ideas, recall from previous sections that pragmatic a priori justification for beliefs is possible whenever beliefs are both conservative and serve non-empirical purposes. This conception of doxastic a priori pragmatic justification can be extended to a conception of a priori pragmatic justification for rules of inference in an obvious way. Now, as noted briefly a few paragraphs back, since classical logic enjoys considerable deductive power, its proofs tend to be simpler and more straightforward than proofs of the same propositions in quantum logic and other weaker systems, with the result that the proofs are easier to find and also easier to understand. These qualities are highly desirable, practically speaking, and they therefore provide a pragmatic justification for retaining classical logic. Moreover, justification they provide is clearly a priori, for the purposes of finding proofs easily and understanding them more or less readily, and clearly be pursued without thereby intending to expand the empirical content of a theory. Okay, so here I mentioned Takayuki's paper. In giving this argument, I focused on proposals for modifying classical logic that involve weakening its rules. The proposal to replace classical logic with quantum logic belongs to this category because it dispenses with left-right distributivity by weakening the rules that apply to disjunction. But if other proposals were to be floated, would they necessarily involve weaker systems? Yes, given that we are considering possible situations in which classical logic combines with empirical assumptions to yield empirical claims that we do not want to accept. The only options for blocking the derivations of such claims involve either weakening classical logic or modifying the empirical assumptions. We conclude then that there is always at least one pragmatic a priori justification for rejecting empirically grounded proposals to revise classical logic. But this is just part of the story. There is also a second such reason. As Quine pointed out, classical logic is central to our system of beliefs. We rely on it in every branch of cognitive science, in every branch of cognitive endeavor, including science, common sense planning and theorizing, moral and aesthetic evaluation, law, philosophy, and theology. Moreover, classical logic is deeply entrenched in all of these areas. Reasoning in accordance with it is second nature to us. Accordingly, it would be a massive undertaking to replace classical logic with a weaker system, one that would probably require generations of retraining. This is a powerful practical reason for maintaining the status quo. Suppose, though, that the empirical problems putting pressure on classical logic were confined to a single circumscribed domain, such as the domain of quantum phenomena, and could therefore be accommodated by logical bifurcation, with a new weaker system being deployed exclusively in reasoning about the problematic domain, and classical logic remaining the operative logic in all other domains. At first sight, a limited revision of this sort might be practically feasible, unlike the comprehensive revision contemplated a moment ago. But there is a weighty empirical reason that counsels against bifurcations of logic. In any case in which one domain exhibits behaviors that are at variance with normal behaviors in other domains, it will still be desirable to describe the empirical relations linking the exotic domain to others, relations that may or may not include causal laws, but that will certainly include statistical correlations and spatiotemporal liaisons, for otherwise the exotic domain might as well be in a different spatio-temporal universe than the others. The domains must share a logic in order for these relations to be expressible. To summarize, there are always two types of a priori pragmatic justification for retaining classical logic, and they each have substantial force. However, there is no obvious reason for thinking that pragmatic considerations should always or even ever be dispositive, dominating the empirical considerations that count in favor of revision. You're practical beings, but you're also beings who do and should maintain a deep respect for empirical evidence. It might be argued that this respect for empirical evidence is ultimately in the service of practical interests, because it is to our long-run advantage to align our beliefs with empirical facts. The questions about the relationship between practical and epistemic values lie well beyond the scope of the present talk. Apologies for having to read it. Thank you all for coming, by the way.
All right, thanks, Chris, for this wonderful lecture. It took me a second to come back from the main room. All right, let me remind the audience how we're going to be proceeding for the Q&A. If you have a question for Chris, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A. And you can just write down your name, and I will promote you to a speaker so that you can actually ask a question directly to Chris himself instead of me being the mediator. So please again go to Q&A, write your name. You don't need to write a question, and then I'll promote you to a panelist, and you can just ask your question directly. So I'll leave you a few seconds. Anil, I will promote you to panelist.
I'm not sure what to do here.
Because we're the host, we can't do it. That's what.
Okay, we're seeing we're on the
Karim and Mark, could you turn the sound off, please?
Hi.
Hey, Anil, we can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. I enjoyed that very much. I have but what about the following kind of case? Suppose let me see if I can.
Yes. Yes, very good. Thanks, Anil. Oh, you were with us for a second.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
I have a question about this weak unrevisability of definitions. Imagine that you have put down an explicit definition, right? Like the one you have for fortnight. X is F if and only if X is G and H, right? But it can happen, but there can be empirical evidence that say H is a flawed concept. Or maybe H has parameters that one did not know about. So there might be empirical evidence that the explicit definition is improper. So there might be some situations in which empirical evidence would lead you to reject an explicit definition. Empirical evidence might show that a definition doesn't meet the laws of logic. So that's the kind of case that I wanted you to consider, at least.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I guess I have to feel my way here for a minute, but I think that I'm inclined to say that in a case of that kind, the motivation for using the definiens is undercut by empirical discovery, and therefore this is compatible with how I'm understanding weak unrevisability. I'm not claiming strong unrevisability, which means that we, would continue to maintain the definition in any empirical context whatsoever. There has to be empirical motivation for the defining ends.
Yeah, but at least in this example, you might have empirical evidence for rejecting the definition. The way you defined weak unrevisability is that.
So I guess that's where we disagree. I mean, I don't think it would be evidence for rejecting it. I think it would be evidence that caused you to abandon it.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Edward, I've lost the sound.
Thanks. Yes. Only 5 years on Zoom and still making beginner mistakes. All right. Mark Wilson, please go ahead, and then Mark from the center.
Okay, Mark. Hi.
Can you hear me? I don't know.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. No, I didn't get the paper. I couldn't watch you and on the screen. Anyway, so I didn't follow a lot of that. But the thing there's always, in the history of science, there are always lots of cases where you want choice of different definitions give you deeper insight into a subject matter. So whether you wanted to define a circle as a right conic section or as a locus of points, equidistant from a point, those are two different definitions. Now, the thing about when you have different definitions like that, one is better for organizational principles than the other. But you have to be careful about how you use them. So I won't give it. In physics, you can define just a total force either in the conventional Newtonian way or in terms of potentials. Those are different definitions, and you find them in different books depending on how they want to set up your formalism. If you put them together, though, they're very creative. In fact, you can get the full import of the postulates for Lagrangian mechanics by just taking that F equals ma definition and joining it to the one in terms of potentials. So I couldn't follow your reasoning. I mean, so if you have a certain theory where you just start with one definition, then adding the other definition to it is not conservative. You get the whole thing back. Now, of course, if you've already added the other definition, then it's just trivial. It's conservative because you've already accepted it. So I just couldn't follow your reasoning.
Mark, I didn't get all of that because I was having technical problems. But what I did get was, what if there are two definitions of the same concept, and you bring them together? Then that allows for creativity.
Yes, I mean, you're right. If depending, yes.
So I guess then.
In other words, take a Lagrangian formulation of classical physics, okay, where you start with a definition of total force. If you add to it the Newtonian sort of definition, it's sort of innocuous, and then you get it doesn't, that would be conservative if you'd already accepted it. But if you don't accept it, okay, if you just start with one of the definitions, add the other one to it, you get the whole theory, which is not a conservative extension. Well, it's not an extension theory of the first definition.
Okay, I think I got it. So I guess what I would say there is, I mean, you can only define a term one way. You know, if you take the Newtonian definition, then the other is the definition. Is
Yeah,
then
you only want to do what you gotta take a choice between them.
yeah, then the other one,
Otherwise, you'll get mush.
yeah, the other one is an empirical assumption.
Well, I don't know if it's empirical. That's why I couldn't follow you. You often it's a choice of which one you want to use. It's a matter of elegance or choice, or the way to set up your theory so that you can prove the theorems is the easiest. Okay,
Yeah.
get to the deeper theorems more quickly. Now, is that an empirical matter or not? I don't know, but it's why you prefer one definition over another and why you change them often in the history of a science. I mean, Quine's thinking of these kinds of things.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that you have to pick what's going to be your definition, and then the other becomes an empirical assumption. You say you don't think that would be right. I don't.
Well, I guess so. I just don't know how to. I don't know how to lean on. You're leaning on empirical in a way that I'm not sure how you separate them out. Relative, yes, you have to. From a logical point of view,
Yeah,
you want to choose one and not try to do two at once.
right.
Okay. Does that mean your choice is empirical?
Well, I mean, you know, you want simplification, and if neither is maximally neither is more creates more simplification than the other, then the choice is arbitrary.
Well, I don't want to keep going. Just in terms of, I don't know how you quantify more simplified than another. Each different approach, each different textbook, and I can give you a lot of different textbooks that handle this issue in different ways.
Well, I'm sure because
none of them seem to me superior to the other. This one's more elegant because you want to get to this body of theorems more quickly than this one, you know.
Right, right. Well, I mean, it seems to me, you know, this is kind of, you know, definitions might be local to projects.
All right. Mark, do you want to follow up? Or...
No, that's it.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for joining us. Mark, the other Mark, Richard at the center. Do you want to join us? All right. Thank you very much.
There, I think I'm on. Thanks, Chris. This is really interesting. I haven't thought about this kind of stuff for a little while. I'm thinking about your discussion of the implicit definitions and move to the Carnap statements as a way of explicating that. That seemed to change from the first part of the paper when you're talking about explicit definitions, because unless I'm misunderstanding you, the Carnap statements invoked an existential claim, and so you seem to be shifting from just relations of meaning, which is the way I normally think about definitions, to relations of reference. And so it seems like the claim then is that these implicitly defined terms have to have a referent. And that doesn't seem quite right. I mean, I'd rather think about something like zero in the piano axioms. I'd rather think about that as defined by the axioms, not what is this thing that is the zero or the nothing, right? That seems to lead us in the wrong direction. So it seems like that the treatment there just didn't seem to jive what I would expect to see out of an implicit definition. Also, I was unconvinced that these would be conservative extensions. If I have a set of axioms, the fragment of the piano axioms, it doesn't have, where nothing mentions that constant that we call zero, and then I add the axioms that do. I mean, clearly I've got a whole bunch of things I can say that I couldn't say otherwise. And by the way, lots of things I can say with the old vocabulary. I don't have to use the new vocabulary of zero. I can say other things as well. And this seems to be a general feature of implicit definitions.
Okay, so maybe there's several questions there. But one, I think, is maybe the piano axioms don't define number in terms of zero and successor, but define all three simultaneously. Well, I think that's fine. That means basically that you're defining all three in terms of the logical structure of the axioms rather than the meaning of any one. But I'm sorry.
No, keep going, Chris.
Oh, okay, okay. Uh, but yeah, I mean that's certainly one way to look at it. I mean, and maybe that's preferable. But if so, there can be a Carnap sentence for with three quantifiers the for first order piano arithmetic.
Mark, do you want to follow up or?
There was more to his question, I think, than I've addressed so far.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I'll pass the floor on to Chris here.
Okay,
Thank you.
Chris, please go ahead.
Thanks, Chris, for the talk. It was really interesting and thought-provoking in ways I didn't expect. You had mentioned in the first section with kind of an allusion to Duhem that there was like a way in which the evaluation of a priori definitions would be kind of democratized in how they were evaluated, which I thought was kind of curious. Because it almost alludes to a much more social nature of the a priori than I typically think philosophers grant. But I think when we're often thinking of science, this actually makes a lot more sense. And even the way you were talking about how in quantum theory, for instance, that we have a shift away from an old classical logic maybe to an alternative form of logic, but that's, at least you're arguing, maybe properly limited to certain areas of physics and not everywhere. And so I was curious on your understanding of like this sort of pragmatist conception of the a priori, whether the a priori, at least for scientists, are kind of like community standards in this way that they'll shift over time. They're somewhat subject, maybe not to empirical evaluation, but at least to how we interact with the empirical world. Do you think that there's this almost kind of inherently social nature, or you could tell me more what you mean by the Duhemian democratization?
Well, Duhemian democratization Duhem argued that when you derive a prediction, all kinds of things enter into the derivation. So possibly definitions are among them, but laws of mathematics, laws of logic. So picking up on that, Quine said, well, if they all enter into the derivation of a prediction, then they all some empirical content accrues to all of them, and this means that every concept, laws of logical concepts as well as defined concepts are have an empirical content. But if they all have an empirical content, then then their empirical discoveries can put empirical pressure on all of them for revision. So I was thinking of not so much of science as social, but of this Duhemian idea that it's democratic with respect to the what goes into an argument for a prediction or an explanation. Yeah. So does that make sense?
That's a very different way of understanding democracy. So thank you. That helped understand it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Jacob, do you want to join us?
Yes, thanks for that. I was very interested in these kind of issues a few years ago, but mostly coming out of the work of Hilary Putnam, who you mentioned in relation to quantum mechanics. So I want to ask how your view relates to what Putnam used to call the contextual a priori, and where that sits kind of in relation to what you were calling weak unrevisability. So when Putnam talked about the contextual a priori, he would always put pressure on the idea that a certain definition or belief kind of has that status until a viable alternative is put into the running. And so I was wondering whether or not that condition of a viable alternative having to be in the running was an additional requirement on weak unrevisability. So would that be like a particular version of weak unrevisability? Is it an extra condition partly between weak unrevisability and strong
Well,
unrevisability?
this might be related to Mark's question. I mean, so maybe what somebody regards as a more fruitful definition is introduced, and then that might, you know, be thought to challenge the original definition. But I want to say that the way it and I agree that that's possible, but I want to say that the way it challenges it is by, I mean, definition and the definition of the same idea in terms of maybe deeper concepts, or more, you know, empirically grounded concepts. Um, uh, uh, I mean, that doesn't refute the original definition. It doesn't show the original definition was false, but what it does is undermine the motivation for the original definition.
Right.
So, I mean, advances in science may cause us to redefine things. You know, that certainly has happened, and it certainly does happen. But I see that as not, I see that as compatible with weak unrevisability, that is, not being refutable by empirical evidence, although the motivation for it can be undermined by a change in the empirical circumstances. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that does. So I get, yeah, I feel like the difference between you and Putnam might be that I think Putnam did want to say that, like, we discovered various things to be false that we had held as unrevisable in the history of science. And I think you're saying more, you don't want to say that. You want to say we came to have motivation for changing the definitions.
Yeah, right.
But we didn't discover them to be false. Okay,
right.
thanks. That helps.
Thanks, Jacob, for joining us. We have time for a few more questions. So please write your name in the Q&A box if you so want. I have a question, but it's a little bit ill-formulated. I was trying to think it through, and I haven't really come up with a really satisfactory question. So let me ask it nonetheless, Chris, and tell me what you think of it. So I'm wondering whether your argument relies on a specific understanding of the relation between what we could call the sense or the intention with an S of a word that might be provided by the definition of a new term and its extension, or what we might call its reference. And whether you are implicitly committed to some form of pictures according to which the extension of a, for example, general term is determined in the sort of Fregean manner by the sense of the terms that's given by the definition. The reason I'm asking, and I'm not sure that's right, but the reason I'm asking is because I was trying to consider the following type of situation where we introduce a new term that we define it using some old vocabulary, and we are successful in referring to a new substance, a new kind, a new class, or whatever, a new property, a new process. But we find out somehow that the definition by which that allowed us to somehow refer to this new kind, process, substance is false, or not necessarily false, maybe is too narrow. It does not encompass the essential properties of the substance, of the kind, of the process. It picks maybe a subset of these properties, or maybe it picks a subset of it picks properties that are true only of a subset of the kind, or of a subset of the samples of the substance. Now, for that view to be even meaningful, it has to be the case that the reference is helped, so to speak. It's fixed by means of the definition, but it's not what part of the extension of the general term isn't just what satisfies the definition. So the point of the definition in that case is just to help you somehow fix onto a substance, a kind in the world, right? So, kind of a more Kripkean picture of the relation between the sense given maybe by definition, maybe by an implicit definition, and the reference of the term. Now, if you have that picture, it seems to me conceivable but maybe I'm mistaken. You know, I said I'm really speaking a little bit. I haven't thought it through. It seems to be at least conceivable that you could have definitions that allow you to fix onto a kind, a substance, a process, a property that are actually false of that kind, substance. Does that make sense? Or you know, it's basically the same. The original question is, how much are you assuming about the relation between meaning, sense, intention with an S, and extension, reference?
Well, there seems to be a lot in what you asked. I mean, one thing is I don't know what sense really is. I mean, if sense is what's preserved in belief contexts,
right,
then I think I mean, then there's the question of whether you can describe the same belief accurately using a definiendum and using a definiens. So can I describe someone's belief accurately by using both fortnight and period of 14 days, or is it are those different beliefs? So I mean, I think you know, hyper-intentional contexts, if they involve preservation of sense and don't permit substitution of definitions, then sense is one thing, but sense might be something else, namely what both a definiendum and a definiens have, a kind of non-extensional meaning that they both have. So so I think that's one issue. But with respect to reference, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that if the definiens has reference, then that the definiendum inherits that reference. But so if period of 14 days has reference, then fortnight has reference. But if
good. And Chris, and by inherit you mean the same reference, right? So
yeah, right.
good. So, but that's something I could contest, couldn't I?
Well, I mean, so what I think I would say, if I understand it, what your point is that this again depends on the distinction between weak unrevisability and strong unrevisability. So if it turns out that the definiens doesn't have reference, that I mean, it almost has reference. Let's consider a situation which it almost has reference, but it doesn't. You know, the properties that it involves don't all exist. Say, then I just think that there are empirical grounds for just dropping the definition, not for rejecting it.
It was not quite the situation I had in mind. So I had in mind a situation where the definitions, so the definition itself, you know, refers as an extension, right? There's a thing about a definite description or something like that, or you know, there are a set of objects fulfilling the definitions.
Mm-hmm.
But the definiendum does not refer to the reference of the definiens, more like in a Kripkean, more like in a Kripkean way, where somehow, I was suggesting to reject the idea that if the definiens is successfully referring, the definiendum inherits.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. So I see what you mean by Kripkean. Yeah, I mean, I just don't think. I mean, that's fixing the reference, not the definition.
Yeah, well, that's right. But you might think that the point of definition just is to fix the reference, and if that's your understanding of the situation, then you have a very clear case in which definitions can be false.
Yeah, I mean, you know, but then I think, I mean, you know, it's always been a Kripkean argument that if you use the F to fix the reference of, I mean, it's not necessary that if you use the F to fix the reference of then that's not necessarily true. Whereas I'm thinking of definitions as things that you can maintain in all contexts. Could I just ask the people assembled if they have some comment on what I said about logic?
I don't know, and it's hard to say. So, all right. I think when had a question, and I'm going to bring him, and then Mark had another question, and then maybe Karim. Karim, do you want to ask your question, or
Let Wayne ask his question first.
all right? Very good. I'll do that. Wayne, floor is yours.
Wayne.
Here I am. Hi.
Hi.
Hey, Chris. Hey there.
Hey.
Gosh, I was gonna let Kareem jump in and then Mark. I was really interested in this sort of conflict that you mentioned about the sort of at the last part of the talk. So it is about logic, but not about logic. I mean, do you think it's going to be important? Well, I think it's important. Do you think there are a good set of norms that we can use to adjudicate? You mentioned incommensurability, but there will be situations in which we'll actually have to decide between the sort of pragmatic forces and other alternative forces.
Yeah.
And have you been thinking about sort of more broadly, or how might one approach that, I think, important project? Have you thought about that?
Well, I mean, I think, both of the things I said, having having simple proofs that are easily, comparatively easily discovered. I think that's very, very important. And I think that also the Quinean consideration that, logic is everywhere. And it would be virtually humanly impossible to switch it out.
Yeah.
I think those are very important considerations, but but empirical considerations are very, very important too. And I mean, the only way I can see to ultimately resolve conflicts here is to argue that concern for evidence is ultimately practical. Then they're on the same playing field, and you can maybe and they're maybe comparable, although it may be totally unclear how to compare them.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was, if you thought there was a viable project of trying to come up with a more sort of general set of norms.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
what would
I think
inform that.
I think you have to put the practical norms and the empirical norms on the same playing field somehow, and maybe you have to be a particularist here. I mean, maybe if you do put them on the same playing field, then it depends on the particulars of a situation, which should get precedence, which seems most important to you. But I mean, what would an argument be that epistemic norms? I mean, I think there maybe is an argument. I mean, why should we care about epistemic norms? And hear somebody saying, your belief should be based on sensory evidence. Somebody else says your belief should be based on reliability. Well, I mean, the only one that makes sense to me really is the reliability, because there's practical value to reliability that isn't clearly the case. I mean, of course, there's some practical value attaching to coherence, but I mean, I don't think that's as important as the practical value attaching to reliability, because that, our action depends upon the reliability of our beliefs, the success of our actions. So, I mean, I think maybe you can subsume concern with evidence under a very general idea of practical value, but that's for a bigger mind than I have, I think.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Sorry, Edward, I can't hear you.
Mark, do you want to join us again? And then Karim.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, I don't have this paper in front of me, and I don't know exactly what a Carnap sentence is, but what you said, maybe you just simple matter. So it is true that in an intuitive sense of implicit definability. One can guess that you want multiplication when you can implicit the two axioms for multiplications do allow you to intuitively figure out that you're talking about multiplication. But the only way you can make that clear is, I mean, if you can rule out non-standard models where the multiplication detaches from
Yeah.
addition. So how do you get, there's not I don't think a first order way of saying, I don't want non-standard models.
That's right, there isn't.
So I didn't follow what's this what magic powers does this Carnap sentence have?
No, it doesn't help us with that. It doesn't, fix the reference. It only fixes the reference of multiplication with respect to standard models. But there's no way your mind can reach out into the world and say only standard models are real, or non-standard models are every bit as real. So I think this is a real problem with mathematics. We basically don't know what we're talking about.
All right, I think we already are near the end. Karim, do you want to ask the last question, and then we'll have to conclude this session?
Sure, thanks. So thanks for a really interesting talk. This isn't something I think about a lot, so forgive me if this question is a bit naive. But I was just thinking of pragmatic justifications more broadly, and it seems that quite frequently they are empirically revisable. So let me just give you a very stupid homely example, right? Like I'm pragmatically justified in using a sledgehammer to smash concrete unless there's a jackhammer around.
Yeah.
Right? And so it looks like that's an empirical question of whether there's a jackhammer around.
Yeah.
And I figure there's something in your machinery that allows you to sort of block that move. But like, I guess I'm wondering, the analog would be something like if I come up with a more effective abbreviative device than what I've had before, I guess, or something like that in a lot of your cases.
Yeah.
Like, I guess I'm just interested in how that works, or what makes the pragmatic justification of these standard candidates for a priori justification distinct from other kinds of pragmatic justification.
Yeah, so this is a form of doxastic justification.
Uh-huh.
So what you described was maybe actually let's see how to describe it. But it's a pragmatic. You have a pragmatic reason for preferring one course of action to another, but that's not doxastic justification. It's practically better to have a jackhammer than a sledgehammer. That's a practical justification of a choice of actions, whereas what I'm after is a kind of practical justification that applies only to beliefs.
Okay, so I guess though I'm not seeing why, simply because the thing that you're trying to justify is beliefs, it isn't subject to what I would take to be a very general norm of pragmatic justification, which is when there's a more effective means around, you should take it.
Yeah, so that's what I mean by the distinction between. I think I try to cover that with the distinction between weak unrevisability and strong unrevisability. Weak unrevisability means that there just can't be empirical evidence that causes you to reject a definition is false, but there can be evidence that undermines your motivation for using this definition.
Okay, so the thought would be, let's just, contrary to fact, let's assume that there is a more effective abbreviative device than Fortnite, for example. Then the thought would be Fortnite would still be a priori justified, but this other thing might also be a priori justified. Is that roughly the picture you have?
It would be if you adopted it as the definition. Suppose, if I can't see how, okay, so yeah, I gave an example involving the disappearance of the concept of day. Mm-hmm. So if there aren't any days, then we kind of lose all motivation for using the concept of day. Since Fortnite is defined in terms of day, we lose all motivation for using Fortnite. and therefore lose all motivation for maintaining the definition. So that would be a case in which our empirical circumstances caused us to abandon a definition, but it wouldn't have been refuted. It would have just been abandoned.
All right. I think that's different, but I know we're out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Karim, for joining us. All right, Chris, I think we've already gone well below our usual time, which was wonderful to have you here. Thanks for everyone who joined us for the talk and also stayed for the Q&A. We hope to see you in person sooner than later, Chris, again in Pittsburgh. Thank you again.
Thanks, Edouard. And thanks, everybody, for coming in for your questions.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.